Welcome to Behind the Headlines, the weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. I'm Tom Williams. It's ugly, but it works. How the legislature will change Utahns' lives this year. The Utah Attorney General charges 11 signature gatherers who helped candidates get on the ballot with fraud. And after President Trump's freeze, another Utah contractor says the feds owe him thousands. It's not the money he's worried about. Joining me today are Salt Lake Tribune politics reporter Robert Gehrke. Robert, thanks for joining us.
Hey, good morning, Tom.
Good morning.
Happy to be here.
State Watch reporter Emily Anderson-Stern is with us. Thanks, Emily.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you. And reporter Shannon Sollitt is with us. Thanks, Shannon.
Morning, Tom.
Good morning. In this first segment, I'd like to kind of go back and forth between Robert and Emily that you had a big omnibus story wrapping up the legislature. Robert, maybe give me two or three of these mini stories. What the legislature did. What stands out to you the most here?
Yeah, it's sort of hard to pick just one. I think if we're talking about a couple things that are going to impact people's lives, I mean the tax cuts are going to we're going to see a small tax cut. Ended up being 97. Excuse me, I'm a little sick today. 97 million statewide, which is about $35 for the average household. It's the fifth year in a row that they've cut taxes. It's always been a priority for the Republican leadership and in the legislature to make sure that they're reducing taxes. So not a big impact there. There's another small tax cut, expanding the child tax credit. So if you have young kids, you can claim that. And then there's a tax for senior citizens that they're going to reduce increase the threshold at which you have to start paying taxes on your Social Security income. So they're going to exempt part of that for, especially, the bottom people on fixed incomes. So, the way they pitch this is they're giving a tax to kids, to families, and to seniors and across the board there.
Emily, what stands out to you? Top of the list here.
One of the biggest things that I covered throughout this last legislative session, and something that will impact people for years to come, are changes to Utah's election system. For over a decade now, counties in the state have been allowed to run their elections entirely by mail. But after the next presidential election, after the biggest bill that was passed when it comes to election changes, people will have to opt in to get their ballot in the mail, which is a huge change. Lawmakers initially decided to give counties permission to run these elections by mail to increase turnout, because Utah had some of the lowest voter turnout in the country. And it did succeed, in increasing turnout. But now, as a lot of Republicans have surfaced, criticisms of election systems and raised concerns about election security. And I will note there was a legislative audit of the Utah election system at the end of 2024, and auditors didn't find any evidence of significant fraud in Utah's elections. But a lot of the Republican officials in Utah who have supported this change have said that they believe they need to make some changes to restore trust among members of their party in elections. And another note, Utahns, when polled, largely do have confidence in Utah's elections and its results, but some Republican lawmakers say they don't.
So Emily, how do I opt in now that I have to?
So there will be, and I will say this bill initially would have effectively ended vote by mail altogether. There were a lot of folks who were opposed to that, including election officials in the state, county clerks. You saw a lot of voting rights activists come out and speak against it. And even, the Senate, the Utah Senate was not they weren't fans of ending vote by mail entirely. And so there were a lot of changes, and one of the compromises that they reached was, instead of everyone getting their ballot in the mail, and then under the previous version of the bill, if people would have gotten their ballot in the mail, but most would have had to return it to a polling place in person, show their ID. The only way to return it through the mail would have been to go in person and apply with your ID to return it through the mail. But now, if you want to return it, get your ballot in the mail and return it through the mail, you opt in, and that would happen, when you're getting a state ID, renewing your driver's license. There'll be ways to opt in online. Or, when you vote in person, you can opt in to vote through the mail in the future.
While we're on this, Emily, I'll just mention, have you mentioned briefly another story you had, which the same group that was behind Project 2025 was also behind, I guess, some of these initiatives, including in Utah, to change the way to go away from vote by mail.
Well, and I will say that's not necessarily the only group that's pushing for what they say is greater election integrity. It's kind of part of a national rightward push when it comes to elections policy. But, this group, the Heritage Foundation, that published Project 2025, initially when lawmakers started bringing up when Republican lawmakers started bringing up their proposals around restricting vote by mail, rolling it back, they kept bringing up this ranking that Utah ranked 33rd in the country for election security. And, that was based on what the Heritage Foundation has published, which is called the Election Integrity Scorecard. And, I talked to a professor, or the director of MIT's elections lab, and he said he talked a little bit about some of the different election policy ratings out there. And, there's some on the left and some on the right, like the Heritage Foundations, that are focused largely on policy and policies that people of those political persuasions think are best. And the Heritage Foundations is one of those. And, among one of the criteria that really, where they really marked Utah down, was because it sent absentee ballots to everyone in the mail. And a lot of the markdowns were focused on Utah's vote by mail system and making sure that everyone gets a ballot in the mail, every active registered voter. And the name is, debate kept going, and the bill kept being presented. The sponsor of the bill, Representative Jefferson Burton, he kept bringing up the Heritage Foundation and its criticisms and the letters in support that they've written for the bill. And he handed out flyers to other lawmakers, saying, here's how we can raise our rating for, like, on the Heritage Foundation's election integrity scorecard. And that seemed to be a lot of the focus of why House Republicans were pushing these policies. They said they wanted to increase election integrity and security, but the ways by which the policies that they were looking at were driven mostly by the Heritage Foundation suggestions. I mentioned earlier in our conversation the audit that came from legislative auditors, and every time legislative auditors do an audit of something, they have recommendations as to how to make things better. And they did give recommendations to Utah's elections officials as to how to increase election security. And, what the suggestions they gave largely focused on reconciliation of ballots, and improving, different, how to verify signatures on mail-in ballots, things like that. But none of the suggestions included rolling back Utah's vote by mail system.
Well, thanks, Emily. Robert, as we all know, the legislature did pass a bill banning unions, public employee unions, from collectively bargaining. Remind us what happened there.
Yeah, this was a bill that passed early on in the session. Basically, it would say that if you belong to a public employee union, your governmental employer can't negotiate your contract with the union. It has to do it directly with the employees. And this is sort of it's a big step nationally. There's a lot of national attention that was focused on it. It ended up being a pretty major fight during the session. The unions packed the rotunda. There were firefighters, police officers, teachers up there pretty much every day. They were debating this bill. The sponsors, Jordan Tusher and Kurt Collimore said that, that when unions win in their negotiations with their public employers, it's at taxpayer expense. And so they think this is a way to make sure that the taxpayers are, well taken care of, even though the union members say that it's a way to make sure that the union members are not well taken care of. There was a glimmer of hope for a compromise version of this bill for a period of time. It would have just said that, the employers can negotiate with the unions if they have 50% of the employees in that office, in that department. But then the sponsors kind of yanked that back because they couldn't get every single union on board. And what they went ahead and passed the more onerous one that would, like I said, ban collective bargaining with in public employee union situations. So this is not over yet, obviously, and it's the governor signed it. There was a big push to get the governor to veto it. He did not, but now the UEA, the Teamsters, the American Federation of Teachers, a long list of Utah unions are running a referendum. They go out and gather signatures, kind of like an initiative, but the sole focus of this is to repeal the HB 267 that banned the collective bargaining. They launched this Saturday is when they filed it. They're this weekend. They're doing a series of events across the state. There's one in Logan, Ogden, West Valley, Taylorsville, St. George. I'm missing one, but they're doing these events to start the signature gathering part of it. It's really difficult. They've got to get 140,000 signatures plus, and they have about 35 days to do it at this point. And so they're launching it today, or I'm sorry, tomorrow, and then by mid-April they've got to have those signatures gathered. And then it's sort of a unique thing in Utah law. After they turn in their signatures, the opponents of the referendum get to go around and try to convince everybody who signed their petitions to remove their signatures. So that means you've got to have a nice comfort, a nice cushion in those to make sure you stay above the 140,784 threshold to make the ballot. So, if they do get the signatures, the bill goes on hold until the 2026 election, so about 18 months. And then if voters approve it, or if voters support the referendum to repeal it, then the law is repealed and it goes back to the status quo.
Yeah, so that'll be an ongoing fight. Emily, tell us about this is a good place to bring this in. Legislature did change the ballot initiative process. Robert was telling us about the process a little bit there. What specific changes did the legislature make to this process?
I will say that Robert actually wrote a lot of these stories around how the ballot initiative process was changed. But one thing that but yeah, there were a lot of changes to it. But I can let him take that on.
Yeah,
okay. Go ahead,
I can feel this one.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So the biggest change, there were sort of two major changes. One is, and this will be a proposed constitutional amendment in 2026. Senator Lincoln Fillmore wants to increase the threshold that a ballot initiative has to get in order to pass if that initiative raises taxes. So if there's a tax increase attached to a ballot initiative, it would have to get 60% support and not just 50% plus one. So it's making it a difficult process even more difficult. And that will be on voters' ballots in 2026, whether they want to approve that or not. The other piece, and this one is sort of well, makes initiatives much harder, frankly, is that if you run a ballot initiative, you have to publish the text of that ballot initiative in newspapers across the state for 60 days before the election. They used the same language, the same requirement that the legislature is supposed to follow for constitutional amendments, but as we talked about on the program last year, they didn't necessarily follow the constitutional publication requirement. But their thinking is, well, if we have to use this meet this publication standard for constitutional amendments, the public should have to do it for ballot initiatives. The cost of that is, according to the fiscal analyst, about $1.4 million. So now you have a situation where anybody who runs a ballot initiative in 2026, excuse me, sorry. Anybody who runs a ballot initiative in 2026 is going to have to pay that 1.4 million to publish the text, or else the initiative will be invalidated. I think there's probably a likelihood that somebody will challenge us in court, because it's basically putting a $1.4 million fee to exercise a constitutional right, and so that could put that in jeopardy. And then in 2026, they're going to try to remove that publication requirement for the constitutional amendments. And if voters pass an amendment removing the publication requirement, it will also go away for ballot initiatives. But at least for 2026, it kind of makes the path to get a ballot initiative on the ballot and passed much more difficult.
Emily, before we go to break, what other story here would you like to treat? There's a bunch here that the legislature did.
This is the fifth year in a row that lawmakers have passed restrictions on LGBTQ plus rights as well. There was, one bill that was published but never made it to debate about limiting public funds from going toward gender affirming care for transgender Utahns. And that, again, like I said, didn't get a debate. It didn't go anywhere. But 2 years after lawmakers voted to bar transgender youth from accessing gender affirming care, they did restrict access for adults when it comes to adults who are incarcerated in correctional facilities in the state. If people enter a correctional facility on hormone treatments, they'll be able to continue those, but people will not be able to start hormone treatments or access any other sort of gender transition surgery while incarcerated. And there are also more limits as to when people can change their names and gender markers while incarcerated. Also, there's a lot of attention around a ban on pride flags. I mean, it was framed as a ban on political flags in schools and at government facilities, but the sponsor of the bill has said repeatedly that it's aimed at pride flags. And you'll see a lot of initially it started out as just focused on schools and was something that lawmakers had looked at doing last year, didn't go anywhere. It was brought back this year. It was expanded to government facilities, and a lot of governments, especially in Salt Lake County, where constituents or voters who elected officials support, showing support for their LGBTQ plus neighbors, support their elected officials in raising pride flags during June, during Pride Month. They, have spoken out against this bill and said that they feel like it's a violation of their First Amendment rights as municipalities.
Well, let's head toward a break. Much more to talk about the legislature and more. You're listening to Behind the Headlines, the weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. Following the break, we'll have more legislative coverage, including a related story. The Utah Attorney General charges 11 signature gatherers who helped candidates get on the ballot with fraud. Later in the program, after President Trump's freeze, another Utah contractor says the feds owe him thousands, but it's not the money he's worried about. We'll have more following this break. You're listening to Behind the Headlines, the weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. I'm Tom Williams. We're talking today with Salt Lake Tribune politics reporter Robert Gehrke, State Watch reporter Emily Anderson-Stern, and reporter Shannon Sollitt. So, Robert, tell me about what the legislature did, or I guess, interestingly, did not do with the courts.
Yeah, so coming into this session, the courts were kind of in the hot seat. The Republican legislators were pretty disgruntled, pretty unhappy with them over a number of rulings that have been issued on abortion and transgender care and the ballot initiative issue, and on and on. And so they ended up there were a number of bills, probably at least 10 different proposals that were to target the courts and try to put a little. Sorry?
I was going to say you cut out just for a moment, but you're back. So
okay, all right. So there were a number of proposals that were kind of targeted at the courts. In the end, there was pushback from the Judicial Council, from the State Bar Association, attorneys sort of up and down the spectrum against doing this. And also, one of the interesting things was on the last night of the session, Governor Cox said he would have vetoed a couple of those bills that were being proposed to target the courts. So they came to an agreement where one of the bills that passed is going to allow the governor to appoint the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and then the Chief Justice would have to go to a Senate confirmation hearing, and then it would have to repeat the process every 4 years. The concern there, and it was expressed by Chief Justice Matthew Durant, is that this is, doesn't really impact him. I guess he figures he's not going to be on the court all that much longer anyway, but it does give the Senate an opportunity to beat up on the Chief Justice if they don't like a ruling, or withhold the confirmation if they don't like a ruling. Again, Governor Cox said on the final night of the session that he has no desire to appoint the Chief Justice. He didn't ask for the bill to pass, and he's not interested in choosing the Chief Justice. That doesn't mean he's going to veto it, though, so I guess we'll kind of wait and see on that one. There are a couple other minor changes to how associations can bring lawsuits that could have a more significant in the case of
sounds like, Robert, you're cut out again.
The bills that would have extended the number of justices on the court, given the legislature the ability to put on the ballot whether a judge is retained or not, those got shelved this year. They could be back next year because we don't have retention elections until 2026. But for this year, at least, that was sort of where they ended up, in sort of a middle ground, I guess, detente. But I think there is a likelihood that we'll be revisiting some of these bills next year.
I want to have you talk, Robert, about this is not legislation, but it's about a legislator. West Valley City Republican Senator Daniel Thatcher is Republican no more. Why?
Yeah, this was something that had been building for a while, I guess you could say. That Senator Thatcher has frequently broken with Republican leadership on some big issues. A tax reform bill that would have increased the sales tax on food, he voted against that. Some of the anti-transgender bills that passed the legislature, he opposed those. He has sort of had this maverick streak for a number of years. This year, he was pretty vocal in his opposition to the public employee union bill that we discussed earlier. He was opposed to some of the changes to the state records committee and the open records stuff. And it just sort of was building early in the session. Before the session started, he lost his office and committee chairmanships, had those taken away. And so it just sort of over the course of the session reached this breaking point until Thursday afternoon. He decided that he was going to announce that he was leaving the Republican Party, changing parties. He's now a member of the Utah Forward Party, which, to my knowledge, is the first elected office that party has held. Um, and so he's decided to abandon the GOP. He said he thinks that the party is not listening to the people, and he doesn't want to be a part of that anymore. And so it was, like I said, a long time coming, but it's a pretty unusual move. I mean, there was a state senator who changed parties for the last like 2 months he was in office. Before that, you'd have to go back to Christine Watkins, who changed to a Republican after she lost as a Democrat, so she wasn't in office. So that's a little bit different. But yeah, it's a and there were people who pointed to that as sort of a indicator of the tension, I guess, between or I guess maybe the amount of control that the Republican Senate leadership is exerting over its members, and finally, like you said, Senator Thatcher reached his breaking point and jumped ship.
One more thing on this, Robert, before we turn back to Emily. House Minority Leader Angela Romero, a Democrat, she says there is more partisan polarization than she's seen in her 13 years in the legislature.
Yeah, that was sort of a recurring theme, I think, in this session. I don't know that I'd say it was necessarily partisan, but there was a lot of tension over, between the legislature was trying to take powers away from school districts, take powers away from cities and counties, and the governor and the judiciary, just sort of accumulating all of this power to itself. One of the lobbyists I quoted in that story said it's the worst session he's seen, and he just, rather than focusing on the things that the state needs, like a good, healthy economy, education, public safety, they ended up with a lot of message bills that he said were mean-spirited and cruel. So that, excuse me, that was sort of a theme that Emily can probably speak to this too, but we heard from a lot of people during the course of this session just how the tone and tenor of it was a little bit more nasty than in years past.
Emily, I want to definitely get to this one. This is interesting. The headline is Utah Attorney General charges 11 signature gatherers who helped candidates get on the ballot with fraud. Recent years, more and more signatures required for a candidate to get on the ballot. I guess more of an opening for some of these paid signature gatherers to not gather actual people's signatures. Is that what happened?
Yeah, I will say Utah does have a pretty high level, a pretty high threshold for signatures to get on the ballot compared to other states where candidates can submit nominating petitions to get on the ballot. But yeah, there were 11 folks who were being charged with forgery and other forgery related charges, who were contractors with signature gathering companies during this last election cycle. This isn't like something super new. In past recent elections, there have been others who've been charged who were contractors with signature gathering companies who were charged with fraud. And in the charging documents, the people being charged acknowledge to investigators some of the reasons they do that. They get money for each signature they collect. And so sometimes with the motivation to make more money, they will sign people's names for them, ask spouses to sign, ask people to sign their own name and then also their spouse's name, things like that. And all of that's in violation of state law. But, as people maybe look at this and say, oh, well, maybe the people we elected shouldn't have been on the ballot. That's not, these charges don't necessarily show that, because if you look at charging documents, the fraudulently collected signatures were largely caught during the signature verification process as not matching the individual signatures that they said they came from. But yeah, this is something that a lot of people who think, the threshold is too high are saying that that's part of the driver for why we keep seeing these fraud charges. Because, say in statewide elections, like for governor, for attorney general, for in the future US Senate, uh, there's a 28,000 signature threshold requirement, which is, for context, that's like over 1,000 more people than everyone who lives in the city of Farmington, which like has its own high school. And so it's quite a lot of people. And in order for a campaign to do that, they can't really rely entirely on their volunteers. They have to hire these signature gathering companies, which then hire contractors who aren't necessarily affiliated with the campaign, or nor do they really care if the campaign gets all of its signatures, just trying to make money. And so the owner of one of these signature gathering companies, one called Gather, which is one that a lot of candidates use, said that, he feels that one of the ways that lawmakers can limit this fraud, if they're concerned about it, is by reducing those signature thresholds so that campaigns can rely mostly on volunteers to collect these signatures.
Well, Emily, thanks for telling us about this. Robert, maybe give us your 1-minute version of this story. Utah lawmakers insert themselves into a mansion battle between Park City and Utah's richest man.
Yeah, there's a lot of history on this one, but the in a nutshell, the Matt Prince, who's the founder of Cloudflare and is the richest man in Utah, has been trying for years to get this home built on the hillside above Park City, right below the ski resort, and it's this massive home that the planning commission, the city initially wouldn't permit. He kind of got it through the process. There was at one point he got they tried to slip language into a bill in the tail end of the session in 2023 that would have basically exempted the home from the planning commission approval. That failed. And so it's been this ongoing process. Now there's a new bill that passed this session that if it works out, it gives the city council the ability to settle this lawsuit that going back and forth that might enable Matt Prince to build his home, where it's still kind of up in the air. There was a sort of last minute tactic trying to slip another bill or another amendment into a bill that would have, again, just exempted the home from most of the planning and historical design standards entirely. But so this is just the latest in a saga that now is entering its third year. So it's quite an ordeal.
You check out the full story at sltrib.com. Thanks, Robert. Appreciate it. So we're going to take another break, and when we come back, we'll talk about this story. After President Trump's freeze, another Utah contractor says the feds owe him thousands, but it's not the money he's worried about. We'll be talking with Salt Lake Tribune reporter Shannon Sollitt. You're listening to Behind the Headlines, the weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. More following this. You're listening to Behind the Headlines, the weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. I'm Tom Williams. We bring now in Salt Lake Tribune reporter Shannon Sollitt. Shannon, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Tom.
So here's the headline. After President Trump's freeze, another Utah contractor says feds owe him thousands. It's not the money he's worried about. Interestingly, the contractor in question is an archaeologist. Tell us about this.
Yeah. So Ken Cannon owns Cannon Heritage Consultants out of Logan. They are an archaeology consulting firm. So most of their job is like any big project that happens, for example, on federal land or using federal money, is required to follow all of these regulations. Also, like, not exclusive to public land or to federal land. There are just regulations that need to be followed to make sure that they aren't like digging up any old remains or old anything. And this Ken's company did a project with the National Park Service. It's one of many contracts that he has had with the federal government. And this one was $10,000, which he said is actually like pretty small, all things considered, but it's half a month's payroll. It's not insignificant. And it's frozen. The funds for it are frozen because they were allocated from the Inflation Reduction Act, which is currently on pause.
Are there other contractors, archaeologists that are affected?
I don't know about archaeologists specifically. I
Mm-hmm.
think it's safe to guess that there are. Ken said his company has a couple of other projects that, like, this is a project that has already been done and invoiced for, and he's not going to get money for it. But he also has some that were like further down the pipeline that are just now on pause. So the work isn't completed, but it might never happen now, or it just is going to take a while. I think it's probably safe to assume that he's not the only archaeologist and archaeology firm affected by this, because again, most archaeology work that happens like on federal lands is done by private contractors. But he is at least he's the second contractor who spoke to the Salt Lake Tribune about unpaid debts with the federal government. The first was a steel contracting company who made some signs for BLM and didn't get paid. And that story was actually what prompted Ken to reach out to me.
Mm-hmm. So obviously, Ken and other contractors want the money that they're owed, but he says it's not even the money he's most worried about.
Yeah. I think he and another archaeologist I talked to, Susie Eskenazi, they are both kind of more worried about the big picture. And even the first time I talked to Ken on the phone, he said that out of the gate. He was like, $10,000 is not insignificant, but it's also, I'm much more worried about what this means for the future of historical preservation down the road, in addition to, funding freezes and layoffs and laying people off that could be doing this work within the federal government. Ken and Susie both said that they're worried about sort of a bigger climate of like deregulation and abolishing some of the very laws and regulations that make their job relevant in the first place. The Antiquities Act, historical preservation. They are worried about, again, sort of a broader ecosystem that might do away with those completely or just like devalue them in a big way. That's their whole job. That's their livelihood. That's their career. And for Susie and Ken both, it's also their passion. They really care about preserving history, preserving historical artifacts, preserving landscapes. And they are both now sort of wondering what happens if that goes away or if, funding for it runs dry.
So they feel like under the Trump administration, some of this thrust, historic preservation, might be devalued.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that there is kind of an appetite to change the way that we manage federal lands and even like give those lands to states or to private landowners. And that would be a huge change in the way that, again, like everything that happens on federal public lands has to follow pretty strict regulations. And if that's no longer true, then there's no watchdog really to make sure that these places are being preserved and that the history on them is being preserved.
So this freeze on these payments, I guess an executive order from President Trump freezing payments under the Inflation Reduction Act. We don't know what's going to. A lot of these things have gone to courts. Do we know if this one's gone to been sent to the courts?
Yep. I think there are more than one lawsuit now specifically about the IRA funding freeze. This is one of those things, kind of like tariffs. It feels like it changes every day. The last group to sue the administration to unfreeze these payments are farmers, saying that they are owed money from these withheld funds. Yeah, this is an ongoing legal battle. And unfortunately, until or unless a judge orders the Trump administration to unfreeze these funds, or until Congress authorizes new money to figure out how to pay for this, then, Ken and other contractors are still just kind of stuck in limbo.
Well, thanks for telling us about this, Shannon. I'd like to move to here near the end of the program to another story you had this week. The headline, in Utah, $2 billion investment is helping build one of the biggest data centers in the world. So I guess, first of all, tell us about what one of these huge data centers looks like and what the needs are. I understand Utah has an advantage because we're high elevation.
That's right. Being in high elevation means that our air is cooler, and in order to run a lot of these data centers, and just even to back up again, data centers are what power a lot of like internet search engines. AI is all powered by data centers, but these spaces and these servers have to stay really, really cool. And since Utah is at high elevation and the air is already pretty cool most of the time, at least, two data centers who are here who I spoke to said that that makes it a little bit easier for them to keep their servers cool. It helps them save a little bit of energy. A lot of data centers cool their servers with water, like evaporative systems. Nova, the one that just got the investment, does not use water, it uses coolant, and it just like uses cool air from Utah, which helps it be a little bit more environmentally friendly. There is concern about how much water data centers use, and Utah's also in a desert and in a drought.
So a place like Nova's, this huge data center, where does that connect in? Is that just help Nova, or would that connect in help other companies?
Connects to, yeah, I mean, Nova has clients all over the country and I think all over the world, in the US, Europe. Any company that uses AI, any company that uses search engines, any company that just like stores data on the internet contracts with data centers like Nova to essentially store and power their systems. And AI is now becoming just like an everyday thing for anyone who uses the internet. So demand for it is increasing. We need, demand for these data centers is also going to increase. And Nova thinks that it can keep up and stay ahead, and even thinks that Utah is poised to be a part of that landscape moving forward.
So AI is really a big driver here, right? Legislators this session, that's one of the reasons why legislative leaders wanted to explore nuclear power, I guess, because the need for electricity is going to really ramp up with AI, right?
It is. And it's hard to understate how much energy these data centers use. One data center alone is like uses way more power than the entire state can even like budget for. And Governor Cox has actually told me before that he's not super interested in like specifically targeting data centers and building infrastructure for data centers, but he is really interested in making sure that we can keep up with Utah's increasing data needs. Operation Gigawatt is a big priority for him this year, was a big legislative priority, a big budget priority. He's trying to really increase our energy capacity. Nuclear is one of the ways that the legislature tried to do that this year. That alone, honestly, like will not work, is not enough for what these data centers need, but it is a start.
So I love these sub headlines. Utah's high. We said that cool and dry. That's a problem, right? Because a lot of these data centers use a lot of water.
They use so much water. Most, again, like they cool their servers using evaporative cooling, which can churn through millions and millions of gallons of water each month. And as the name suggests, it's evaporative cooling, so all of that water is disappearing. It's not being recirculated. Nova, the one featured in this article, does not use water to cool its servers. It uses actual coolant, and it's a closed loop circulatory system. So, 10% of the data center's water use is used for cooling processes. The rest of it is just plumbing for the building, which, they have essentially touted a few times as like their way of being stewards of the land. But not all data centers do that. The rest use millions and millions of gallons of water. And Utah doesn't have that much water. We're kind of famously in a drought. So it's something that we're going to have to be mindful of moving forward.
No, some legislators seem to want these data centers here. Do we get tax money out of this? Is there an advantage for having the data centers here instead of elsewhere?
Yeah, we do get some tax revenues from like property taxes and energy power use taxes. No, it's not an insignificant amount. I think some of the economic criticisms of data centers is that they don't require a ton of manpower. Like once they're built, you kind of set it and forget it. So they're not really adding that many jobs to local economies. They're taking up land. They're using resources like power and water. Wes Swenson, CEO of Nova, this data center, told me that they pay millions of dollars in taxes every year. They employ roughly 100, close to 200 local employees to keep the data center running. And then also, just the process of building the rest of this data center will employ hundreds of other people indirectly. So, it's not an insignificant contribution. But we'll see. Again, Cox told me that he's not hugely concerned with creating infrastructure for data centers specifically, but there is an appetite and there is a demand for them.
Well, Shannon, thanks for telling us about this.
Thank you, Tom.
Shannon Sollitt, reporter for Salt Lake Tribune. Well, you're listening to Behind the Headlines, and it's time for Underplayed Stories of the Week. Let's start with politics reporter Robert Gehrke. Robert, what's your underplayed story?
Sorry, I was muted. I'm going to plug one that Emily Anderson Stern, who was working bright and early this morning, posted this morning. Lieutenant Governor Henderson made a plea to the Trump administration to not erase women who are buried in Arlington Cemetery. I guess the administration took off the headstone, or took out of its prominent headstones on the webpage the headstone for Seraph Young. And she wants to bring them back and not erase that history. So that's was just popped up on the website this morning, and Emily did a nice job on it.
All right, sltrib.com for that one. Emily Anderson Stern, what's your underplayed story?
Thanks, Robert. I appreciate you plugging that. One that I thought deserves a little bit more attention is one from Palak Jaiswal about this legislative session. First of all, I'll say there were debates over how to address lunch debt and make sure that kids who can't afford lunch get a meal. And one teacher in Weber County has turned to social media to do TikTok dances to raise money so that her students can eat.
All right, sltrib.com for that one as well. Shannon Sollitt, what's your underplayed story?
I'm going to do a sports story today, which is unusual for me, but Jason Patacchio had a really lovely story earlier this week about the mother of a Utes basketball player who bought an RV and is now almost a full-time, van lifer in order to follow her son around the country and go to every one of his games. And I thought it was just really lovely and well done.
All right, sltrib.com for that one as well. Well, on the program today, we've been talking with Salt Lake Tribune politics reporter Robert Gehrke. Robert, thanks so much. And I hope Robert feels better as we go along as well. State Watch reporter Emily Anderson Stern, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
And reporter Shannon Sollitt, thanks.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
And thanks, everyone, for listening. You've been listening to Behind the Headlines, the weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. I'm Tom Williams. Hope you join me next time.
Quitting an addiction is never easy. I'm Dr. Lynn Pascarella, president of the American Association of Colleges and Universities. And today on the Academic Minute, Jamie Hartman-Boyce, assistant professor of health policy and management at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, explores one new way to try.
Vapes, also known as electronic cigarettes, are handheld devices that heat liquid that contains a mix of flavors and often nicotine. Lots of people who vape are interested in quitting, but nicotine is addictive, and quitting nicotine vapes can be difficult. We set out to review the evidence on the best ways to help people quit vaping. We found 9 studies, including over 5,000 participants. Studies tested nicotine replacement therapy, cytosine, and varenicline, all medications that are effective for helping people stop smoking. Studies also tested a text message-based intervention for young people and a plan to help people reduce the nicotine in their vapes. We found some evidence that a text message-based intervention may help youth and young adults stop vaping nicotine. We don't know whether we'd find the same results for other text message-based interventions or in older adults. We also found some evidence that the medication varenicline may help people to stop vaping nicotine, but this was just in one study and more evidence is needed. Varenicline is available via prescription. It helps by blocking the rewarding effects of nicotine. There is not enough information to say whether any of the other interventions help people to stop vaping long-term. There are stories in the news of people turning to cigarettes in order to quit vaping. No studies test this because vaping nicotine is substantially less dangerous than smoking traditional cigarettes. Evidence is clear that no one should start smoking as a way to quit vaping. Most of the harms that come from smoking come from burning tobacco. Electronic cigarettes don't contain tobacco leaf, and vaping doesn't involve burning anything. Lots of people want to know how to safely and effectively quit vaping. More studies of evidence-based interventions for quitting vaping are underway. Through a process called a living systematic review, we will keep looking for new studies and updating our review when important new findings emerge.
That was Jamie Hartman-Boyce of the University of Massachusetts Amherst. You can find this, other segments, and more information about the professors at academicminute.org.
Production support for the Academic Minute comes from AAC and U, advancing liberal learning and research for the public good.